when it was built. And I was fortunate in that my folks moved to Orange County from Massachusetts, in Maryland and vicinity. And what I was fortunate about was I had the Irvine Ranch as my backyard. And it took me, about 30 minutes of a bike ride to get to the Irvine Ranch. But when I'd get to the border, I'd head out and spend the whole day out there for weeks or week after week, with the intent of finding herps, reptiles, amphibians, and anything natural history oriented. I found a lot of fossils. I found a lot of interesting plants, and I gradually fine-tuned myself as I got into high school and, of course, into college. Turned out that birds were going to be my field of interest, my focus, and in particular, birds of prey. So I started out with a master's working on red-shouldered hawk habitat and home range use, followed by a PhD about 20 years later looking at natal dispersal and phallopatry and vagrancy and red-tailed hawks and red-shouldered hawks. So my whole goal in life was to not only conserve raptors, but more importantly, conserve their habitat. So I've had some pretty intense negotiations with the Irvine Company, Rancho Mission Viejo, Tejon Ranch, and other ranches in Southern California as they've set aside lands and tried to decide what lands they were going to protect. So with that, let me jump into the actual program. Brianna, can you flip on the first one? So during this interval, let me get rid of this notice. Back in the 80s, 1982 to 1987, I got to work on a bird that I never had worked on and had no plans on working on. That is the California condor. So from 1982 and 1987, I was brought in to capture all the wild free-flying California condors and either bring them into captivity or attach radio transmitters to them. The reason I bring up condors in this meeting here in Orange County is that they were indeed here in Orange County. Harry Stevenson, back like in the 40s, wrote The Shadows of Old Saddleback, a great book that you should all read if you haven't already. But he mentions California, or mentions condors in the Santa Ana Mountains. And there's a recent revision on the historical component of Laguna Beach. And there's an account there by the author. I know his first name, but his last name is Thurston. But he mentions about 15 California condors, and he describes them well enough to make a believable story. So they probably nested in those caves in Laguna. I suspect they nested in the caves of Black Star Canyon and Fremont Canyon, all those rocky niches. But I worked in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Kern counties when on the condor program. And let me go back that one more, Brianna, just real quick. The history of the California condor, starting in the Pleistocene, is on the left, upper left, when California condors were probably feeding on Pleistocene mammoths and ground sloths and such. As the range of those animals decreased, so did the range of the California condor. It slipped all the way over to the Pacific coast. And then we wound up in 1982 when I started with that little horseshoe-shaped range when there were about 21 condors. And then down in the lower right, you can see where we were about 5 years ago. Today, there are over 500 California condors in California. So this is a very successful program. Next. There's a lot to be said for the endangered species program, and the fact that we still have California condors is evidence of its power and good deeds. This is a little history of the Condor program. 1975 was a Condor recovery plan. 1982 is when they caught the first Condor. 2019 down there at the bottom, we banned lead, which turned out to be the primary cause of lead poisoning in California condors. Next, please. No one had really captured California condors in any serious way. So that was one of the first issues we had to solve before figuring out what was killing the birds. Because the way we were going to find out what was killing them was to take blood samples and attach radio transmitters to them and find them dead when they died. And those transmitters allowed us to do that. Indeed, the first California condor that we ever found dead was, I think, in 1983. And it had actual lead shrapnel in its gut that it had consumed, presumably from a hunter-killed deer or pig or some other animal. There's a lot of pig hunting in the Tehachapis. The two traps here we're using are pit traps and cannon nets. Cannon net allows you a 50 by 50 foot area to capture the birds in, and the pit trap allows you to be very careful and kind of like a surgical strike on grabbing exactly the bird you want and nobody else. The cannon net frequently captured golden eagles and ravens with it. Next, please. So between 1992 and 2017, we learned a lot. 76 California condors died of lead poisoning. That was the principal cause of death that we were aware of, and that's still the case. And even with the lead ban in California, California condors continue to die of lead poisoning, as do golden eagles, bald eagles, and a lot of other species. See, a bunch of them were electrocuted, about 16 to lead or to electrocution, shooting 7. Why would anybody shoot a California condor? Next. The number of release sites. These are Pinnacles National Monument, the Ventana Wilderness Area, San Simeon, Bitter Creek, which was the original release site, the Vermilion Cliffs in Arizona, and there's also a group of about 40 birds down in the Sierra San Pedro Martir of northern Baja California. Off to the right there is a typical release site where the birds are held. We could get these back in Orange County, but would have to provide them with food. That would be the principal reason why not to, because there isn't much hunting left in Orange County, and there's no cattle either to speak of, other than a few on Rancho Mission Viejo. But my point is that we have condors all around us. We just don't have any here anymore. But it is plausible. Next, please. What's the future like for California condors? It's a great success story for the moment, but funding is an issue. Lead toxicosis will remain an issue for a long time to come. There's a lot of lead in people's closets that they purchased and have stockpiled, been passed on from grandfather to son and that sort of thing. Microtrash is still an issue. We don't really know what's going on there, but the adults bring in trash with the food that they regurgitate into the young, and sometimes the young die. Organochlorines, the same thing that was an issue with peregrine falcons and bald eagles, is also a serious issue with California condors, largely because they feed on pinnipeds, whales, and cetaceans and pinnipeds such as sea lions, which have a lot of fat and where organochlorines are stored. Habitat loss is still an issue, is an ongoing issue with all species. The California condor will probably have plenty of habitat, though, for a couple of centuries, frankly. And West Nile virus is another emerging disease. And the birds are actually being inoculated to prevent their exposure to that. Next, please. So I mentioned my interest in natal dispersal. And it's, I could do a whole lecture on this subject, but I'm going to keep it relatively brief. But let's just go through this. Of course, it has a conservation impact because gene flow is what dispersal is. It's the movement of birds and their genes to different areas, or I should say animals or plants. And it propels evolution, in part because animals wind up in places where you wouldn't think, and they evolve differently than they would have when they were back home. And the distances they travel in the case of birds can be thousands of miles off course, and basically vagrants, and establish new populations, such as what happened in the Hawaiian Islands and in the Galapagos, where two species of hawks independently arrived there, Swainson's hawks and red-tailed hawks, and created their own species eventually. Dispersal, though, isn't necessarily long distance. What I've discovered is that most animals don't disperse very far. The majority of them are almost, you could say, inhibited. They practice what we refer to as limited dispersal, or more scientific term is philopatry. It's the tendency for animals and plants to not leave their natal area, or to at least not go very far. And this kind of flies in the face of why animals disperse, because we always, as scientists, thought, at least I was taught, that the reason for dispersal was to get away from your relatives. They didn't want any of those genes getting too close to each other and having anything close to inbreeding depression occur. So I always thought that these animals would disperse great distances, but the reality is they disperse short distances, even though they have the power to travel thousands of miles. Next, please. So I've been banding birds here in Orange County since 1970. That puts me somewhere around 53 or 54 years doing this. And I'm starting to have some results. But the way you accomplish, the way you learn something from banding is you band a lot of nestlings. I say nestlings in particular because that's what I'm interested in, natal dispersal. I want to know where those nestlings are going relative to their siblings and their mom and their dad. So in order to do that, you need a large study area. Well, my study area included all of Orange County, all the way down to Camp Pendleton, Naval Weapons Station Fallbrook, and at various satellite locations across California, so I could try to detect longer distance migrants. You need to expend tens of thousands of hours and dollars, and while doing so, attempting to recapture those very birds that you banded years or decades prior. And you analyze that recapture data for nestlings, and you also get involved with the banding data collected by the bird banding laboratory, because they're the warehouse for all this good stuff. These are burrowing owls, by the way, one nest with 4 young. They might have as many as 11 young in a good year. Next, please. So the definition of phallopatry is one having a median natal dispersal distance of less than 10 territories in magnitude. And I refined that to strongly phallopatric were those that were less than 5 diameters. Red-tails and red-shouldered hawks were where I focused, but I also band a lot of golden eagles and Cooper's hawks and barn owls and great horned owls. So I'm examining the whole suite of raptors, most of them anywhere here in Southern California, looking at dispersal. They're a handy organism because they're relatively large. Many of them are quite obvious. They're even somewhat abundant in many cases, like the red-tailed hawk. Next. So here's something you might not have thought would have happened, and I didn't either. But when I first started working with red-tailed hawks and banding young, I noticed that they disappeared in the summer. I had no idea what they were doing, but there literally were no young red-tails in Orange County in 1970 and 1975 and 1980. And it wasn't until I got some transmitters on birds and had banded 7,500 nestlings in Orange and San Diego, Western Riverside counties that I was able to figure it out while pursuing my PhD. This explosive looking figure on the right are red-tailed hawks that were banded as nestlings and recovered in their first year of life and greater than 100 kilometers from their location. And what jumps out at anybody pretty quick is a strong propensity for red-tailed hawks to move north. But what's fascinating is, you know, I always thought that red-tailed hawks came to Southern California to winter. And that's true, but who would have thought that red-tailed hawks in Southern California would go north, even cross the Continental Divide up into Montana? So this is one of the discoveries made by me and my associates after banding 7,500 chicks and putting transmitters on 17 of them. I'll show you what some of those birds did. Hang on one second, I want to check something. Well, I was going to check something. There we go, 18 minutes. Gauging my time. Next, please. So here's some here on the left is a Laguna Canyon female red-tailed hawk that we transmitted in 2004, who lived up until 2007. And on the left side are all of the spring, summer northbound migrations. She made 4 of them. And on the other side are the southbound migrations. But what the punchline is, she generally went to the same ballpark, that is Idaho, Eastern Oregon, and she returned to the same area where she was born. And she did that 4 times. And unfortunately, was electrocuted on a power pole. Next, please. Looking at some actual data about that. If we look at the combined total, that's the third line there, we recaptured 96 birds that I had previously banded as nestlings. That's like finding a needle in a haystack. I said that like it was simple. It wasn't. It took decades to get 96 birds. However, we also got a bunch from the public. But I'm just going to speak, because I have a very short amount of time, on the subject of recaptures. But the median was 5 kilometers for 96 birds. 5 kilometers is like 2 or 3 territory diameters. So they're not going very far when they fledge. So what I want to do next, and I've been collecting a whole lot of blood samples, is to look not only at the physical movements of the birds, but the genetic relatedness of all these birds nesting so close to each other. Because I'm of the opinion that we can probably distinguish between a bird born on Mount San Gorgonio or Mount San Jacinto and one in the Mojave Desert and one in Laguna Beach or one at the Mexican border. I think genetics is getting so strong, so robust that we should be able to distinguish the relatedness and the genetic and determine if any sort of genetic structuring is occurring. logically, there is some genetic structuring occurring because there's 14 subspecies of this animal across North America. So a great animal to look at the genetics of. Next, please. Red-shouldered hawks. I also looked at vagrancy. Neat subject. This is like long distance dispersal under duress. These birds move. Vagrants are animals that are outside, are found outside of the recognized breeding, wintering, and migratory corridors. And we think of red-shouldered hawks as normally being quite sedentary, and they are. But occasionally birds do crazy things, and we'll go to the next slide, please. And we get some interesting results. I had 119 recoveries from the bird banding laboratory. 10 of those were long distance dispersers. That is, they flew greater than 100 kilometers. Those are the ones here on my map. There's 10 of them there. But 3 of them, one up at Nevada, the one in Baja del Sur, number 4 down there, and Las Vegas, Nevada, are all 3 vagrants because they literally moved outside of their normal range, as the normal range on this map is the green area. They shouldn't be outside that, but they are. And one of the interesting things we learned about, and that's why when it comes to answering that question, why disperse? Well, it's a good thing to disperse for a variety of reasons, but you don't want to disperse too far, because if you're a long distance disperser, you're not going to live very long. In the case of bullet number 3, 8 of the 10 long distance dispersers that traveled greater than 100 kilometers were found dead or near death at 22 months. The oldest bird was 8.6 years. But when it came to looking at the long distance disperser or the short distance dispersers, if they move less than 100 kilometers, the oldest bird wound up being almost 20 years of age. So for short distance dispersers, the word is you're going to reproduce and have a productive life in that respect. Next, please. Or as this bird is suggesting, don't disperse, stay at home. And these birds fit the definitions of vagrants too. They traveled north, east, and south, basically random directions, nothing straight line like migration would be. Next. And so another thing happened. I thought, and I know I'm running out of time already, I thought that the adults, once they landed on their territories when they were 3 or 4 years of age and found a mate, that they would stay put. But one of our birds was survived to the age of 7 and made multiple migrations further as an adult. And it migrated when there was drought. When the drought conditions were severe, it migrated back to the place it first summered as a young bird. Isn't that special? And then we discovered, we didn't band as many of them, but we discovered that Cooper's hawks apparently do the same thing, but we didn't band as many, so our map isn't quite as distinctive. Next. And here's the burrowing owl. The last pair, last breeding pair in Orange County was 2000, actually I think it was 2014, not 15. Change that later. Next, please. For a lot of you, let's skip this one. A variety of reasons contributed to the extirpation and extinction of the burrowing owl, the breeding burrowing owl in Orange County, but habitat loss was 90% of it. And under habitat loss, I consider habitat degradation and habitat fragmentation as being major contributing factors. This is true for a lot of species, but the burrowing owl, it just nailed. Next, please. And if you want to see an interesting paper, I have a manuscript that's due out in fall in September, documenting the last the historical evidence for the burrowing owl breeding in Orange County, as well as the extirpation of the last breeding pair, 2014. Oh, actually, I know why. Yeah, the last pair was 2014 breeding pair, but in 2015 there were 2 females, hence not a typical pair. Next, please. How close am I to 30 minutes?
You're doing fine. Keep going.
All right, so golden eagles. This is an animal I've worked a lot on lately. I'll try to be brief. But in 1974, the Forest Service, the Trabuco district, asked me if I would volunteer on one of their helicopter flights and look for golden eagle nests in the Trabuco district. So I volunteered, and we found something like a dozen, about 12 nests, about 12 different pairs. And today, almost all of those pairs are gone. And I looked at them over time, and gradually we've lost our golden eagle population in Orange County and in the local surrounding counties, including Chino Hills State Park had 4 pairs. Chino Hills State Park is loved to death. There's so many people using it that golden eagles can't use it, quite frankly. And the other big problem is we knocked out the jackrabbit. The black-tailed jackrabbit is extirpated in Orange County, except for Naval Weapons Station Seal Beach. How about that? Next, please. These are the mortality factors that we know affect golden eagles in Orange County: electrocution, collisions, lead poisoning, rodenticides, West Nile virus, maybe, but probably, leg hole traps, direct shooting, and the possibility of climate change affecting golden eagle prey is ever present. That as the temperatures increase, the water in the ground decreases, there's less vegetation, less squirrels, less rabbits, fewer golden eagle nesting attempts. Next. Here's my favorite rabbit. And they also like California ground squirrels. And Orange County systematically poisoned a lot of its ground squirrels. So a lot of the habitat that was once golden eagle foraging habitat in the lowlands is not anymore, but now those places are covered in homes and commercial developments. So we lost our eagles, except for a few pairs that occasionally nest in the Santa Anas or right on the edge of the Santa Anas. Next. Here I am with USGS, a USGS biologist out of San Diego, and we're about to show you some of the places that golden eagles move about in the region. Next. So these are 2 longer distance movements. The bird on the right is actually from Orange County and was banded as an adult, trapped and banded as an adult up by Fremont Canyon. And the one in San Diego County, as you can see, went from a little east of Oceanside all the way down to basically San Quintin, the vicinity of San Quintin in the Vizcaino Desert. They also returned, I might add. But there are also pairs that live very sedentary lives and don't go much further than about 20 kilometers from their nest. Next, please. That little adventure, by the way, is a powerful one because dispersal and migration make animals vulnerable to a lot of mortality factors that might not be as prevalent in another location. For instance, Orange County probably does not offer a lot of lead exposure to golden eagles, but it does it does have a problem as far as habitat loss. Those places those birds migrate, there was no habitat loss where they flew, but on some of them, there are wind turbines. There is lead because hunting is a very big recreational behavior of people in the Southwest. So these birds may not get exposed to lead in Orange County very much, but they sure do whenever they wander outside to another state where lead has not been banned for hunting. Emphasis, banned for hunting. It has not been banned in the state of California for law enforcement and target shooting, etc. Next, please. Here's Swainson's hawk. Used to nest in Orange County, disappeared somewhere around 1940. They migrate to Argentina. Next, please. Next. Turkey vultures. Now, there's a bird that's doing well in Orange County. We've marked 500 in the last 25 years. And we're getting some good information. We're looking at lead exposure. And we're also looking at the movements of the birds. And the majority of birds that we tag here in Orange County stay in the LA basin in northern San Diego County. Next. Taking blood and feather samples, looking at lead and other contaminants. Next, please. These are all professors and graduate students here in Southern California. Turkey vultures are a wonderful animal to work with because you can measure lead in the environment. You can capture them fairly easily. Taking blood is pretty easy because they're a large bird and they're not threatened or endangered, which means permitting is a lot easier. But yet they're a wonderful test tube in terms of looking at lead exposure in these birds. Next. Here's a turkey vulture nest, a couple of them. These are two different turkey vulture nests in Orange County. One in right off the 241 toll road near San Diego Creek, and this one is at the mouth of the lower one is at the mouth of Fremont Canyon. They don't build a stick nest. They just find this deep nook or crack, and lay 2 eggs. And 8 weeks later, you have a turkey vulture, or 8 weeks later, it fledges. Next, please. Next. These are some of the movements, some of the first movements up until 2017, but we now have about 3,000 observations from the public. Next. Here are 3 conservation successes in Orange County. We have ospreys breeding in Orange County. When I came here in 1970, there were no ospreys breeding, there were no peregrines breeding, there were no bald eagles breeding. That's the Endangered Species Act. These birds got some of the money, although the osprey did not. It came back because of the work done on the eagle and the peregrines. But very powerful piece of legislation. Next, please. These are animals that are conservation challenges to varying degrees. The short-eared owl no longer breeds in Orange County, no longer breeds in Southern California, and is there are probably less than 100 birds breeding in California, in my opinion. Red-tailed hawks, you say red-tailed hawks, Pete, they're everywhere. Well, no, they're not. They're not where they used to be. We're probably looking at 30 or 40% fewer pairs of red tails than I did in the 70s. And that's on ranches that should have been undisturbed. Spotted owl, I'll just mention it briefly. You guys have these up in Silverado, Trabuco. Very rare, but occasionally they drop down in the uppermost reaches of Trabuco and Silverado, Majeska, and Bell Canyon on the Star Ranch Audubon Sanctuary. White-tailed kite has dropped about 90% in terms of more than 90% in terms of the number of breeding pairs between the 1980s and today. we had, I think, I had 112 territories identified in 1985. We now have about 5 territories in Orange County. I just talked about golden eagles, red-shouldered hawks. Similarly, it seems like they're a wetland preferring animal, riparian type habitat, and I think the water loss in those riparian areas has meant that the numbers of Cooper's hawks, red-shouldered hawks, and short-eared owls and kites have responded to this climate change issue by reducing their population size. Next. And there are a lot of people to acknowledgement agencies. These are them. Do you guys have any questions? How did I do that? Wind up at 30 minutes?
Hey,
I do have a
fabulous.
question. I have a question. One of the owls that you mentioned doesn't breed here anymore. The short-eared owl, I believe it was. Do we know why?
Almost certainly habitat loss. In fact, it is. It's certainly 90% or greater habitat loss has been the reason. The
And
last place
What exactly is
last
their
place they
habitat
bred
that
in
they
Orange
lost?
County, the last place they bred in Orange County was around the Newport Back Bay in the San Joaquin Marsh vicinity.
And they don't breed there anymore. What exactly did they lose? I mean, when you say habitat, what exactly did they lose?
They lost grasslands and marshes,
Okay.
estuaries.
Hey, any more questions? Now's a good time.
I have a question. The burrowing owls, were those the ones that they were trying to save at the Bolsa Chica wetlands?
Yes, yes. The short-eared owl too. Both those birds, both those species still winter at Bolsa Chica, but it's like we'll see less than 5 birds per year of either species at Bolsa Chica and Newport Back Bay. So they're very rare now and no breeders.
No breeders. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who usually pays for research like this?
You know what? It's a good question. Most of this is paid for by me. I just took it on as a kind of like my life responsibility. I grew up with bald eagles and peregrine falcons and ospreys being gone, and I thought, what a neat thing to do with the rest of your life, but monitor the other bird of prey populations and see what they're doing. So I've largely funded this myself, but I have had a good grants from Rancho Mission Viejo, the Irvine Ranch, Spence Porter of Communication Specialists have been very, very supportive of me. But mostly it's me and associates that volunteer with me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question, Peter. Thank you for your presentation. And I had a question. Is there any simple way that we can potentially attract some of these raptors to our properties?
Yes, there are 2 of the species, western screech owls and barn owls, readily take to properly constructed nest boxes. And you can probably also do it with great horned owls, but building a large nest basket, so it would be more like the size of a raven nest or a red-tailed hawk nest, and just build an artificial structure. You could probably use tires, for instance. Just haul them up into the top of a tree on a good location, wedge it in between major branches and add sticks, and I think great horned owls will come. But the hawks, most of these animals, what they need is habitat. And nest structures are habitat. So we can do that at least. So I guarantee you can increase the number of barn owls, screech owls, and probably great horns in your neighborhoods by systematically and wisely placing those boxes in good places.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
So we got time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah, Mike,
Mike.
you got something? I can't hear you. Are you on mute? Sorry, can't hear you. Okay,
Mike, I can't hear you.
no, he doesn't know. Okay.
Understood.
Um,
I've been there myself.
Well, I think we're going to end the presentation now. I thought it was totally fascinating.
Mhm.
So I really appreciate your coming, and we have a round of applause for those of
Yeah.
us who are
Well,
here.
I really appreciate your invitation. It's really great to speak to locals.
Yeah.
It really is. I kind of
Locals.
jumped at this opportunity. So
Yeah.
thank you for the invitation. Anytime.
Yeah, no, it was really, really interesting. So greatly appreciate it. I guess I can stop recording now.
Okay.
Let's see here.
Repeat.